This is the Sports Tech Playbook, a podcast series on sports technology hosted by Daoud of Compliance Standards and Julian Blinn of Upside Global. Thank you for listening.
All right, well, welcome back to the Sports Tech Playbook, where we unpack how innovation really works inside the world of elite sports. I am Daoud from Compliance Standards, and as usual, I'm joined by Julian Blinn, analyst and founder of Upside Global. So this is the third installment today. We're taking on one of the biggest misconceptions, I think, that's taking place in the industry, and that is the more sports tech companies there are, the more innovation is reaching teams. In reality, there are over 10,000 companies in that space, as far as my understanding is, but a large share of them are built around a sort of a single product or a niche feature. About 30-40%, from what I understand, of these companies are early stage startups, but even the more mature vendors often solve just one narrow problem. Well, that helps explain why elite teams are flooded with options but adopt so few. The bottleneck isn't supply, it's relevance. It's also about fit, and it's about trust. So today, we're asking really what makes a sport tech company worth taking seriously, and why do most never make it past the first conversation with the team's staff. So Julian, thank you for coming again.
No, it's great to have you back. You on the show again. So thank you for welcoming me.
Pleasure. And so I understand you'll be flying to Europe today. So thank you again for your time. And let me start with with sort of the basic question, right? I read a number of analyses that suggest that there are now over 10,000 sports tech companies worldwide. This is seemingly a crowded number, maybe. But what's driving this boom?
I think what is driving is, lots of founders, first of all, people love sports, right? So I think there's a lot of interest from founders, engineers to work with teams. Many of them are just, sports fans, and they want to find a way, just like I did, right, to help and work with the teams. But like you mentioned earlier, right? Yeah, 10,000 sports tech startups, but how many of them are just one guy or two guys, right? They only have one product. Or sometimes they have no money. They literally self-finance the prototype, and so they have very, very limited resources. And sometimes they don't have customers. Most of the time they have no customers. So it's like I say, it's tough to get in front of those teams. It's tough to get their attention, and you really have to hit the home run most of the time. So there's a lot of things you have to hit right, because if you don't, then they're not going to get back to you.
Yeah, so I read that the proportion of startups in the sports tech world accounts for about 30-40%. Call it a third of the startup world, of the sports tech world, represent startups. The rest are mature or mid-stage companies. Does age matter when it comes to credibility with teams, longevity, etc.? Or in other words, are the 70% companies better off than the 30-40%?
So your first question was, does the age matter? I mean, if you're a bright, college graduate, you know how to build technologies, you're well connected in that space already, or you have some advisors, I think you've got a shot. I think I was reading a statistic the other day saying that on average, CEOs are probably in their 45 or 47 years old. But in the sports tech world, many of those startup CEOs, they're fairly young, right? Like 25, 30, 35 years old. So I would argue that they're probably pretty young. I think the majority of them tend to be like male founders, which to me is a problem, because there's not enough female executive. And I think that there's a lack of diversity, in my opinion. And I talked about that on podcasts before. But I don't think there's a net age minimum. I mean, of course, if you're 17, 18, I would say, that you just, maybe it's too young. You might want to finish your degree and, do that. But I don't think there's the 25, 30, I think it's totally fine from what I've seen.
Yeah. And obviously, if you made it past the startup stage, and if you are sort of the mid stage or the mature stage, Does that mean you are in a better position or there's still a lot of uncertainty?
Well, as any startups, right? I mean, most of the time, those startups founded, they start building a prototype. They raise a bit of money from family and friends, and then they go and try to get some seed funding, maybe from some angel investors. Maybe they raise like 100, 200, 300,000, maybe half a million. But there's still a long way to go, especially if you build like a hardware product where it's more capital intensive. And
Hmm.
most of the time, they have to raise the minimum like $1 million, right? If you want to build the hardware, because you have to go into mass production, you've got your hard cost, and it's you got to keep raising, and the magic number I've heard for like hardware companies, usually it's like if you can get to like $5 million of investment, then you can cover your engineering costs, your marketing, your sales. But you got to keep. I mean, you have to keep raising all the time,
Yeah. Yeah.
because until you really have some very significant sales, you have a run. I mean, you know how much runway you've got. You have to pay your employees. You have to pay to your designers to produce the product, and it's just not cheap, right?
No.
Especially for hardware. Software is cheaper, and you got higher margins, but for hardware, it gets a catch-22.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And there's too many moving parts on the hardware side
Yeah.
that you may not be able to control it, by yourself. You have to have those relationships with the ODMs and the parts makers, etc. I read one statistic, and I don't know if you can confirm it, that the sports world, that is the number of active teams in the U.S. alone, when you take the pros, the college, etc., is between 20 to 25,000. Does that number sound right to you? I mean, is that's the
25,000. Okay, but do you include the high school market, or you just include like the major sports leagues, so NBA, NFL, MLS, MLB, NCAA, and then you include the high schools, or no high schools?
so the numbers show that professional teams in league is up to 300. So so I have a range here. College athletic departments, 1,500, 1,500. That's a small
Yeah.
number. High school athletic programs are probably the biggest chunk, 19,000.
Mm-hmm.
And youth and amateur and private organizations, 10,000 plus. And then there is something called NGBs and federations,
Yeah. That's about
are
right.
so just 70. So does that number sound about right? I
I
mean,
think it
that's,
does. Yep, it does. Yep, because if you look at professional teams that make the major leagues, right? And NBA, NFL, MLS, MLB, that's about I think 300, over 300, right? But then once you got the college team, that's a lot more than that. D1,
yeah.
D2,
So
D3.
yeah, so this is a U.S. number, which means and the U.S. number equivalent for tech companies is 4,000, 5,000. Does that sound like a crowded space for you, or 4,000 versus 20,000, maybe not so?
I No, I think the number seems right. What I find is that sports tech startups on the performance side, a lot of them want to focus on college, because you got many more colleges, NCAA teams in the US, and like as I mentioned before on the podcast, some of those NCAA teams. So let's say, for example, Ohio State, USC, they've got between 15 to 20 NCAA teams: basketball, football, tennis, golf, whatever you name it, right? And that's between 500 to 1,000 student athletes, right? So that's a much bigger market than, let's say, signing up an NFL team with 90 players, or signing
Mm,
up an MLS team with maybe like 20 players, right? So I think what sports tech startups do, usually they go after the big teams in the big leagues. Let's say they start with the NBA or the NFL, the MLS, and then once they want to go big and drive sales, they go into college sports, right? But now what I'm seeing
yeah.
is there's more and more startups. It's still small. They're going after the high school market because it's a massive market, and they don't always understand that many of those high schools, they get money from taxes, gambling, the state, and they have
Mm.
private donors to literally buy lots of equipment, products, and they have money. But the challenge is, how do you get to those high schools? It's very fragmented. So, but I'm seeing more, not a lot, but more startups in sports and tech looking into the high school market because it's the biggest.
Going back to the topic, many companies uh, that are in the sports business only offer, as you know, one core product
Yeah.
and or one service. Does that influence how teams view them? Are they seen as maybe too narrow, or does it depend on the category? And do teams see this landscape as an exciting thing because we love competition, right?
Hmm.
So even if it's one product or one service, and there are many players that pits them against one another, it's good for competition. Or is it an exhausting work for the procurement folks and the guys in the teams that need to oversee that?
I don't think it's a problem to have one product. For example, I did an interview just last week with a company called Output Sports. They got a one sensor, but it's connected to a platform, a software platform, when they keep enhancing capabilities with new insights, algorithm, and that to me it's not a problem at all. I think the product is good and it does what they said it would do, and you can improve the quality of the insights and the analytics. That's all you need. And the teams are not going to say, no, we're not interested in working with you guys if you only have one sensor. I think it comes down to, first, is the product good? Does it do what it does? Is it backed by science and research? Do you have customers? And I don't see any problem with the teams. Don't have a problem with that usually. So
Yeah, yeah. So it's not necessarily an exhausting thing, but how do they keep track of what's out there when there is so much overlap and so much competition and so many players out there?
well, that's why we do what we do. Right? With Upside, we build a platform. We keep track. We have a big database of all the vendors, the products, and everything. And we're just about to launch a new product actually on at the dinner that we're doing at the NBA Summer League, where the teams will be able to literally get the information in 2 seconds. They'll be able to do comparison of specs and pricing. They understand, they can ask what the product we build, what is the best product in this category? How do you compare this vendor versus this other vendor? Because at the end of the day, to your point earlier, the practitioners, an athletic trainer, a head of performance or rehab, doesn't have time to look at 10, 20 different websites and companies. They're just crazy busy. Every single day, they got to take care of the players, the athletes, they in the weight room, the fitness room, the rehab room.
Yeah.
So it's very hard for them to keep track. And I think that's why they appreciate what we do when we kind of build those tools for them to find the right product for the right price point based on what they're looking for.
Yeah, I'm just gonna do a quick analogy and then I'll ask you the question. So
Yeah.
if you do enterprise IT, data centers, etc., you have two stakeholders. You have the supplier and you have the user. And in both cases, the bigger the company, the bigger both organizations are, right? You have the Dells and IBMs and HPs of the world that are gigantic organizations sort of covering what a client would need, like a big bank. In the
Mhm.
case of sports, you just talked a minute ago how sort of they track, and are we talking about small, relatively small organizations within sports team, even if it's gigantic names, the Celtics and the Lakers, all right? Facing also an ecosystem of tech companies that are also small. Maybe, or are we talking about small startups and small tech companies versus oversized organizations that require all sorts of checks and balances, also sort of information systems to keep track? Or are we talking about two small businesses somehow that are
Oh,
dealing with one another?
I mean the startups sometimes they got a size of 5, 10 people, employees. I mean in some of the departments within the sports teams, right? If you're talking about the performance department, sometimes they have like 15 employees. I mean, most of the time they have less than that. You've got your head of performance, you've got a head of a trainer, the head of rehab, the physical therapist, the nutritionist. Sometimes they have an IT team like a developer, but it's not very that common.
Yeah.
But it's not a big gigantic staff. Like it's very within organization, right? You've got let's say the sales guys, right? The customer service team, the admin, right? The GM, and I mean it's not a big department. The athletic department, the performance and the medical department is not. You're not talking about 100 people, right?
Yeah.
It's a fairly small size, if you see what I mean.
And so I'm assuming they really have to rely on folks like you to spot the fluff. I mean, there's got to be, when you have so many companies out there that are producing so many different things, one product, maybe
Yeah.
two or three product and a service. I would imagine that sports team have the ability to figure out how to spot where the fluff is taking place. Is it something that they do proactively? Is it something that they rely on folks like you, or?
No, I mean, it depends. Some teams have, like, for example, the performance guys. They do their own analysis. They go and do reviews. Sometimes they have head of innovation, a head of tech, who is responsible for scouting and vetting those companies. But we're here to help them. And teams have different resources. Some teams have very small staff. Some teams they got more capabilities. But we don't try to step on their toes. We just try to complement what they're already doing, right? But there's a ton of information out there, and I think it's hard for the teams sometimes to keep track of what's out there. But really, how do you know the one that I've vetted, the one that that are legit? Because the vendors will tell you everything is great. We're the best in what we do. But how do you know? You don't know the whole backstories, right? You don't. And that's why I always tell the team, look, if I know something it's not so great about a vendor, I'll tell you. I have to tell you, right? Because if I introduce you to a vendor, or you requested that I introduce you to a particular vendor, and I don't tell you, I never told you there were some issues for X, Y reasons, then they're gonna say, well, why didn't you tell me? And so, like I said, the vendors they'll tell you what they'll give you their speech, but there's a lot of vetting and there's a lot of information that they don't know.
Yeah, and I'm assuming, sports organizations might have different level of tolerance to what they're facing. In other words, are they generally more skeptical when a new company is showing up, or are they sort of, yes, this is great. This is something, we might discover something different, something new. Is there excitement, or is this sort of, very skeptical? We got to make sure that, before we get them through the door, that we know what they're doing.
I think it depends really on the team. Some teams they want to look at everything. They want to look at all the latest and greatest tech. Some other teams like, wait a minute here, okay? We're not going to jump on everything. We have these goals, right, that we set for the year. We're going to reduce injury. We're going to improve sleep of the players, and then they can find those tech. But usually the teams are excited, but some teams also, some that I know, they won't even talk to a vendor if there's no research, there's no studies. That's number one. And if there's no studies, then okay, we'll come back when you have one. So you've got, extremes, right? But one side doesn't fit all, and teams have different appetite, they have different capabilities, and then it depends on the people in those teams. Some guys are very experienced, some practitioners are very experienced. Some of them are, hey, I want to use this latest and greatest tech because one of my friends told me about it. But then some other more experienced guys and say, look, I'm not going to jump on everything. I just want to do my due diligence first. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And so, there's this concept of traction, versus innovation, and that comes to mind.
Yeah.
Traction meaning, you're a sports tech company and you're doing the right things. You're moving along. People hear about you, right? Typically, you can think of Samsung, and I mean, there's tons of examples. Yeah. Apple, all these guys, they have a great product, but they also have traction. Versus innovation, somebody that comes in that may not have that kind of traction, but really has a great product out there. How do they balance? I'm assuming you're going to say probably a little bit of both. Maybe each company, each sports team is different.
Yeah, so I think it depends. So obviously, if Samsung is sponsoring a team, right? For example, in Korea, South Korea, Samsung they have lots of relationship with baseball team, for example, right? Or Samsung sponsor maybe Chelsea back in the day, right? Obviously, if that's the case, then they try to work with some of those technology vendors. Oh, that's part of the deal. If Samsung signed a deal with a team, then they agree to use some of their tech, right? Now, of course, if there's cutting edge technologies, because you have to remember, like I mentioned that before, like some of those big vendors, they don't move as fast as some of the other smaller startups, right? That's why they go and buy them sometime, because they can get
Yeah.
an edge. They can acquire engineering talent, technologies, right? But absolutely, yeah, the teams, if and most of the time, if there's something innovative, it's coming from the little guys, right? But the other
Hmm.
question is this startup or that vendor, do they have the financial backing? Are they going to go out of, shut down in 12 months? They don't want that either, right? So they want to make sure that, one, they have solid backing. Number two, they have scientific evidence that what they say they can do is actually true and it's backed by studies. And they have to also know how to work with team. And that's why the vendors who are founded by some guys who come from sports and elite sports, they know how to talk. They know how to talk to the team because they've been there, right? They've been in their shoes. And that's how they're able to win deals faster than maybe a guy who's an engineer and he built a cool product, but he doesn't know how to sell it to the team. He doesn't have relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. And on that front, you get two names floating around there.
Yeah.
One is the company name, and one is the founder or the principals or the people behind it personally.
Mm-hmm.
Does the age of company matter less than the people behind it, really?
I
I
think
mean,
what matters is do they have not just a prototype, but something that you can take off the shelf sometimes. Like some teams in the NBA that I talk to say, I want to take the product off the shelf. Some teams don't like to experiment with prototypes. They want this thing. Hey, can I go and buy it? Like, is it ready to go? Like, is it a commercialized product? Because if it's not, there's a risk for me, right? And some teams are willing to work with the startups almost as a research partner. They're willing to do it, give them guidance, do studies. But some other teams, they want to buy something that's ready to go. They're not going to go and spend like 3 months working for the startups on a study or help them to design a product. Many teams don't want to do that. So again, it goes
yeah.
back to the willingness of the practitioners to work with the startups or not. Do they want to get a prototype? Is that okay with them? Or do they just want to buy a commercialized product? So because there's risk associated with that, right?
Or how often does a startup invite, say, let's say an athlete to be part of the investor pool, or even, get a stake to be able to, an equity stake to be able to get into their team?
Yeah.
Are athletes playing a role on the supply side?
Oh yeah, a lot. I mean, there's a lot of guys in the NBA, or the NFL, and all the leagues. It's just as they're playing, they know that the career is going to be short. They're not going to be playing forever. So
Mm,
what they do is, I've seen athletes, for example, Tad Young, who's an NBA player, investing in 200 companies, 200 startups. He built
yeah.
his family office. He's got his own team, and he said to me during an interview, he said, "I want to make as much money when I'm done and retired from basketball. I want to make sure I'm as successful and make as much money when I was playing." So that it's very common for athletes across different leagues to be an advisor, to invest in companies, to make bets, because they want to be able to be involved, and they want to be active and investors, and because it's like a business, right? You make a couple of you're gambling on a couple of startups. You're hoping that they're going to get big. You have some equity, and that's how you're going to get your return on investment.
Yeah. And is this a relatively new phenomenon? I mean, I suppose,
No,
you know,
I mean it's been done for like, even like when I started like over 10 years ago, they were already doing that. But I
mm,
think now it's very common. The question is, does the startup has a relationship? Can they get access to the players? Because sometimes it's hard, right? So, but once they do, it's very common for them to see on their VC deck, right? We've got this player in the NBA as an advisor, right? We've got these other guys. It's pretty common. It's a common playbook, but it's not always easy to get a hold of those athletes, because, as you know, they're highly solicited, and sometimes they turn down opportunities because they don't just want to get, they want to make sure it's a company that's sound. Because obviously the startups are they're gonna want to work with any athletes, right? Especially in the NBA or the NFL or other leagues. But that is the athlete willing to put his name and his reputation, on the line, and sometimes they just want to. Sometimes the startups wants to get investments from the athletes, but sometimes athletes say, I'm not going to put money. I just want to get equity. And for some
Yes.
startups, they're not willing to do that. So, and like I said, the other opposite would be a startup CEO say, look, I don't mind having you as an advisor. I want to have you as an advisor, but you have to put some money on the table.
Yeah, yeah, and reputation is important. I think I don't know if you recall, without naming names, there athletes sponsoring or supporting or publicly a crypto currency company, and
Yep.
that went very very badly. It's always difficult, and you just mentioned that, but um, let's say 4,000 companies in the US.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you are a startup 1 year old one, or whether you are already a 10-year-old company,
Yep.
what would you recommend? So this is sort of the recommendation phase. What would you recommend would be the best way to break through so much noise? I know you gave a lot of pointers, but if you were to
Mm-hmm.
bullet point a number of them that are sort of immediate that come to mind.
To get traction with the teams, you mean?
Yes, in other words, you're not just part of the 4,000 companies that are floating around, but you are amongst sort of the winners that are able to capture that penetrate those teams and capture potentially business going forward.
Well, first of all, one, you got to get a product that's commercializable, that you can sell. Two, you want a product that's backed by real science and real evidence. Three, you want to have customers, so you have to find a way to get the first pilots in the door and the paid customer, right? Uh, like you said earlier, you also might want to get some athletes as an advisor because it's going to elevate your profile. But at the end of the day, it's a competition, right? There's so many vendors competing for the same customers in this highly competitive, because there's only a handful of teams, right? If you look at the NBA, that's over 30 teams. If you look at the MLS, same thing. So, all those vendors want to get a hold of those teams to sign them up as a customer. So it's very competitive. So it's a race. You really have to be creative and agile and be persistent to sign those teams. And that's why sometimes some teams are negotiating in the price, and sometimes I'm not going to pay for this because they're very well known. So it's like, at the end of the day, it's highly competitive. So you have to find a way to get an edge, because the investors are looking at you like, okay, well, how many customers do you have? How many teams are buying the product? Because pilots are pilots, but it doesn't mean that they're paying for the product. So you really have to show traction, but really sales and revenue and recurring annual revenue, because that's how you're going to be able to raise more money. Because in the eye of the investor, at the end of the day, they just want to get a return on investment. So if they want to start a company 10x, 5 to 10 years after that, they need to see the traction, and they need to see that's going to be sustainable.
Yeah, and that's openness, transparency, sharing information, all that stuff is a problem when you're dealing with companies that are small, that are privately held.
Yeah.
I deal with it on a regular basis in my own area of coverage. But any signs that this industry is shifting towards more openness, more, in terms of these companies providing more visibility. I know you're doing a great job there to try to put together something like this in your platform, but is there willingness? Do they understand? In other words, being tech innovator is probably not enough. And is there anything else that these tech innovators are thinking about to make their business model more interesting by opening and talking about it?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of very successful stuff that I deal with. What they're very good at is, for example, they put together case studies to demonstrate that, teams, whether it's in Premier League or the NBA, they use their product and they're able to see a return on investment, whether it's injury reduction or whether it's getting the guys back on the field faster, right? Faster rehab. So there's ways I think you can elevate yourself, right? Doing case studies, speaking at conferences, right? Doing webinars, like elevating your brand, because you don't want to be just perceived as a vendor building product, but you really want to be almost like a thought leader that can help to move the industry forward. And sometimes startup founders don't have the knowledge or maybe the know-how or even the willingness, right, to be out there in conferences, because it's going to help them, right? They're perceived as thought leaders, not just the guy who wants to build a product, but really want to help the industry forward, I think it's going to elevate their profile, which will increase, their chance of being successful and getting more sales. But really, the perception will change. The one thing I would say is that the number that came across, like 10 years ago, it was like 4,000 or 5,000 sports tech startups. Now it's 10,000. And to me, that's a problem, right? Because there's a lot of unvalidated products out there that popping up every single week, but there's no scientific evidence. There's no real business model. I would even argue they have sometimes no teams. And even sometimes I've seen what that was called, let's take a husband and wife. Husband is a good engineer, build a product, and it's like what do you call it? One of those businesses. It's like leisure, or you can pay for vacation. You can go, travel the world, meet the teams. And I feel like sometimes startups, you see more and more of those. They want to take the opportunity to build a side business, right? To go and travel, to pay for additional stuff. But are they really serious about building a big business? No, they just want to, so I think those 10,000 startups, I think there's a ton of them in that number. But I think I'm more interested in the really good startups, the one that have a real business model, they have traction, they have scientific evidence. And I think, unfortunately, and it's not just sports and tech, there's a lot of startups who are opportunistic, founders that are opportunistic. They love sports. They want to be, people say, hey, I work with the 49ers. I work with the Warriors. But do they really want to bring this thing to the next level? Sometimes they don't.
Yes.
It's enough for them to go and say, hey, I'm going to go with my wife. I'll go to Dubai. I'll go to Barcelona. I'll go meet the FC Barcelona. Do they have a big vision and big goals? No, because what happened is they don't even want to raise money. They don't want to raise millions of dollars. They don't need to. They're comfortable, getting sales and doing fine. They're doing okay, but it's in their mind, it's not going to be a big business. They don't want it to be that way.
Yeah, the issue of professionalization is a big thing. You're absolutely right. I think a lot of them are solopreneurs, I think they call them, that might have a great idea and some connections here and there to try to get additional income. That makes sense, and that's where basically folks like you are there to sort of identify the fluff and separate it from the reality. So,
and it's a race for the teams, right? It's a race for the team because they don't always know that's the plan, that's the goal. But if you really want to grow and go big, you need to raise money. You get bigger resources. Now, granted, some startups have done a great job without raising much money, but they're very focused on this is the plan. We're going to treat this as a business. But unfortunately, there's a lot of vendors who don't do it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that comes, we are getting to our conclusion there.
Yeah.
And so, in conclusion, what I'd like to say is that what have we learned today? And thank you, Julian, for helping us with this, is that the sport tech space may seem massive, but the reality is more nuanced, right? Yes, there are over, 10,000 companies, but many, like you pointed out a minute ago, are single product players with limited scopes, many, solopreneurs, and about a third are early stage startups still trying to prove their fit, right? So elite teams, in conclusion, say, they don't necessarily need more options. Maybe they do, but probably most of them would say they need more, the right solution, if you will, one that's proven, relevant, one that's able to integrate into existing systems without, of course, adding risks. Whether you're a founder, whether you're a buyer, the lesson is clear from what I learned today is quality still wins, good management still wins, but quality means more than just innovation. It means alignment and management, etc. So before we wrap up, guys, a quick preview of what's coming up in 2 weeks from now. So episode 4, that is, we're shifting focus from the pros to the college space. Admittedly, I'm not a big, I don't know anything about this, so this is going to be a learning curve for me. But I'm told that the college space is where one of the biggest untapped opportunities in sports tech, where things are unfolding there. With over, from some of the statistics that I was just reading here, over 1,100 NCAA programs, and apparently hundreds of thousands of athletes. College sports represents apparently a massive decentralized, often misunderstood market. And we hopefully, Julian will come and will help us go through navigating that landscape, what makes college decision makers different from pro teams, etc. So that's that's in 2 weeks from now on the Sports Tech Playbook. Thank you for joining us. And Julian, thank you very much.
It's always great to be on your show. So thank you, David.